Hello, we are Group 6, and this is our presentation on the script and story of Mr. Burns. Oh, an emergency alert! It looks here that we'll be going over synopsis and theme, reading Mr. Burns, story and script, our production pitch, and there will be a conclusion. Mr. Burns explains the story of a group of survivors waiting out a plague after the mass failure of nuclear power plants across the country. They reimagine an episode of The Simpsons' Cape Fear, to be exact, and examine the way the story has changed right after the plague, then 7 years after, then 75 years into the future. Through the years, we see the survivors, by means of a theater troupe, explain and try to find a reason to live in a harsh and unforgiving world where everything you love is gone.
Next, we have our theme. Storytelling is a means to survival and evolution with tales altered by time. Reading Mr. Burns. Mr. Burns is a modern play that embraces the absurdism in pop culture, but also how we use pop culture to survive over time. While reading Mr. Burns, it can be difficult to follow along at times, with the dialogue becoming disjointed, characters talking over each other, and jumping into the setting without any context. This is also supported by the 3 distinct acts that have different characters, settings, and motivations for each act. However, while reading Mr. Burns, you were given the chance to dissect each pop culture reference involved and how those moving parts influence the final act of the play. While this play can be a challenging read, it also broadens ourselves to new ways of playwriting and creating stories for not just ourselves, but for others in the future. Next, we have script and story. Here are the 3 main points we are going to go over, one for each act. First, we will go over the impact of pop culture and how that relates to the story of Mr. Burns. In Act 1, our characters remember and reminisce about one of their favorite Simpsons episodes. The impact of pop culture affects the way we perceive the world, but also how we connect with it. Our ensemble uses pop culture as a means of survival, giving the group a sense of hope for the daunting future. We can all relate to this impact that pop culture has, giving us the same courage to face our fears and stand up for what is right. Next, we examine the commercial sequences of Act 2 and Mr. Burns. Mr. Burns highlights another impactful phenomena in pop culture, the use of commercials. Commercials are mostly forgotten as they interrupt and break away from what we are viewing. However, in Mr. Burns, they are a way of creating normalcy in a changed world. The ensemble is shown as enjoying the commercials, an oddity to today's standards. While commercials now are seen as a nuisance, commercials in the post-apocalyptic world of Mr. Burns are a necessity to retell the stories that could be so easily forgotten. On to the final third act of the play, which occurs 75 years later, we see how the play has changed over time to become much darker than what we remember of The Simpsons. Mr. Burns gives us a dark and brutal shift for the pop culture icons, becoming something that is much less familiar to us. The dark shift reflects how our ensemble interprets their world, as it grows dark and gloomy surviving in this post-apocalyptic world. The villain also shifts from being Sideshow Bob in the first 2 acts to Mr. Burns, the manager of the power plants in the imaginary Springfield. This particular character switch can be supported by the apocalypse being caused by nuclear power plants shutting down and exploding, explaining why years later the villain switches to reflect the survivors' own experiences. The shift highlights how pop culture evolves based on our environment, while still holding on to key aspects, for example, the Simpson family never changing. Mr. Burns urges us to explore the themes of evolving stories, similar to how humans evolve over time. Pop culture changes with time, creating new pop cultures along the way, while still holding on to the key ingredients that make an icon stick.
And now we present to you our production pitch. Mr. Burns deconstructs how a work of art can evolve and change meaning to mold into whatever message society needs to hear. You can see this idea in modern-day revivals of Golden Age musicals and in the way that this play shows the evolution of The Simpsons episode Camp Fear. Our first key element concerns costuming. The costume design in our production will change from act to act, emphasizing the changes brought about by the passage of time. In Act 1, our characters will wear camping attire with color schemes that foreshadow the Simpsons character that each will later portray. For Act 2, repurposed items will be used to form costumes that resemble Simpsons characters. Disposable commercial products, which were, in the pre-apocalyptic world, considered valueless after the use of their contents, are now preserved and reworked into icons. Act 3 will shift into a darker costume design that emphasizes the metamorphosis into myth. Our troupe actors will be dressed in costumes that are reminiscent of those used in the traditional Italian theater of Commedia dell'arte, which is known for utilizing stock characters. This reinforces how the Simpsons characters have transcended their nature as confined to the show and have become cornerstones of cultural expression. Our second key element concerns sound design. For our production, we will use iconic sounds from The Simpsons show, such as the theme music in the third act and transition music. In the background, we will hear the music written for the show HMS Pinafore every time we see the troupe perform the episode, but as we travel through the acts, it gets more and more eerie and distorted. We will also show commercials during scene shifts to foreshadow Act 2 and pay homage to cable TV. Our first key moment happens in Act 1, when the ensemble meets Gibson for the first time and they cross-reference names in their books. With each new name and age that is said, there will be a silhouette that represents that person projected on the back wall. This shows how important these people are to the characters because they are only allowed 10 people to ask about. This is also reflected in the beginning of the third act when all of the names are being read aloud during the choral moment. Our second key moment happens during Act 2 when Gibson has a freak out about forgetting a conversation that he doesn't remember. He begins yelling at the other troupe members. As he continues his rants, a green light will slowly light the stage, getting brighter and brighter. We also plan on having the sound of a Geiger counter, radiation detector, in the background getting louder and louder. These two elements will represent the panic and stress that the current nuclear power plant situation has brought to everyone. The lights will go back to normal and sound disappears when Sam snaps Gibson out of this moment. We regret to inform you, this is the end of our presentation. Thank you from Group 6.